Hey everybody, welcome back. So today we're kind of looking at the second half of our exploration of medieval Europe. This is the time period from like 400 to 1400 AD in Europe. And then once we're done with this, we'll move on to looking at other parts of the world during the same rough time period, like China. But right now we're looking at medieval Europe, so let's go ahead and get on into it. Okay, so let's see here. Sorry, just a sec, technical difficulties. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention that we haven't talked about yet for medieval Europe is what's called the feudal system. So you've probably heard, the images that come to mind for medieval Europe, you've probably heard of the knights and the kings and the castles and the peasants. Well, basically all of that worked in a very specific way. So let's talk about that. Basically, there was a system of kings giving land to knights and knights sort of renting the land to peasants. So when we talk about the feudal system, there's basically three tiers here. At the very top is the absolute landlords. Now this could be kings, or this could be some other sort of duke or something like that. Some very powerful person who's very much in charge in their society, possibly has royal blood, something like that. And this lord or king will provide a land grant to what's known as a vassal. A vassal, is a word that means something like a loyal follower type of person, and sort of implies a military basis. And that's exactly what we see here. The vassals in the feudal system are the famous knights. So we think of knights as something like, oh, everybody could become a knight. Well, not quite. Knights were usually of a higher sort of social rank than peasants. Knights, they were people who had land themselves to some extent. And we could call them the nobles, if we want to say the kings and then the nobles, like the next tier down from them. The knights are basically people who have a certain amount of land that was granted to them by the king. And so the knight, the noble, usually has a sort of mansion and an estate. So the knights usually have a lot of people working for them. And the knights have peasants working on their land. So basically they've got all this land that was granted to them by the king, like this whole big mansion or sector or town or something like that. And so they get all the peasants in town to work on the land. And so the peasants are kind of renting the land in a way from the knights. And the way this works is they have to give the knights whose manors they work on, they have to give them some of their food. So the knights end up with more food than the peasants. The peasants get to keep enough to survive, and the knights get a lot of extra food for partying and living it up. But there's all sorts of similar obligations that go through with all this. Everybody benefits in a certain way. For instance, the peasants, who are also known as serfs, they get protection. So the knight is going to lead an army to defend them if their country gets invaded. So the noble knight will be leading the army, and then the other peasants will sign up as sort of rank and file soldiers. And then the knight will be at the head of the charge and defeat other knights. So very often it's other knights and other nobles that the knights are protecting the peasants from. And then in terms of the lords and the kings, the knights also provide military service to the kings. So the king wants to go have a big war. Well, the knight is going to get his armor, which he has, saved up some money to have all this armor and these horses and stuff. And the knight is going to be loyal to the king and go help him fight his wars. So the kings give the knights land, and the knights give the kings military service. The knights or nobles give basically a place for the peasants to work, farms for the peasants to work, and military protection from outside invaders. And then return the peasants give the knights, the nobles, a lot of their food and sort of cultivate the land. So that's basically how the whole system works. Everybody has their own place in it. And there's some similar ones that we see in other parts of the world, like Japan. But yeah, this is what feudalism is, basically. The land grant that the king gives to the knight is known as a fief. And another important concept is fealty. that the knight swears loyalty to the king. And there's a famous story of a loyal knight of Charlemagne's. We remember Charlemagne from last time. That this knight was loyal to him and sweared this big oath, and it was a big deal in this famous poem about Charlemagne. So yeah, so that's the story of the feudal system. Just kind of important to keep in mind how it works. People didn't think about it, this formally, but they did know that you had certain duties to whoever's land you were working on. Okay, so now let's talk about architecture. Basically, there's two styles of cathedrals that we really see during the Middle Ages. And the first style is much more similar to Roman styles of building. And so we call it Romanesque. I kind of showed off the Hagia Sophia and how Christian architecture kind of evolved out of the Roman basilica, right? So we had all of that. And just a sec, let me check something here. Okay, we're back. So let's get back to architecture. Yeah, so this is the Romanesque style. It's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, a lot of simple patterns in the stone, and they continue to build cathedrals, which are basically shaped like crosses. But they, as you can see, they add a lot of elaboration onto it and towers and stuff like that. That's the style of architecture that dominates for most of the Middle Ages. But then when we get to the late Middle Ages, a new style comes along. Just a sec. We're glitching out. Oh no. Let's see. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. Okay. Oh, yes, and here's some more examples of Romanesque architecture, including one that's very modern from Colorado. Then when we get to... This is glitching out so much. Sorry, guys. Okay, the second style is Gothic architecture, which comes along around the 1200s. And so this is a style that kind of evolved out of the other style. If you look at it, what are the differences here compared to what we were looking at before? Everything looks a lot spikier. That's how you can tell Gothic architecture at a glance is spikiness. There's a lot of thin detail work. There's a lot of stark lines. It looks more serious, more intimidating. It looks sort of ominous in various ways. Intense, this is about an intense relationship with God. Yeah, and usually in these Gothic cathedrals, there'd be a lot more use of light and shadow, so it could be very dark or very bright. And so, actually, interestingly, the name Gothic architecture comes along as a criticism of this new style that didn't have a name before. People said it looked like a bunch of Goths made it. And so Goths, you remember, they were sort of the barbarian tribe. And so there was a feeling that this was a sort of barbaric style. And it's funny because that's actually where we get the concept Goth in the long term. So we have the barbarian tribe, and then the style of architecture was named after them. And then much later on in the 19 and 1800s, people started writing a lot of poetry that had this sort of moody, serious style. And so they and literature, and so they called themselves Gothic. They were writing Gothic literature, and then a lot of people more recently started dressing in black and wearing heavy makeup because they were inspired by Gothic literature. So that's how you get from Goths to Goths. But yeah, the style of Gothic architecture involves all this spikiness and all this detail. Also, a lot more stained glass. Stained glass becomes really popular during this time period. And there's a fair bit more realism, whereas the Romanesque cathedral was content to have sculptures that were pretty simplistic. Here we see a more interest in detail and maybe more interest in history and going back to thinking about Greece and Rome and that sort of stuff, whereas before there wasn't as much of that. And we also, of course, have the flying buttresses. So, yes, here's another. We've got Chartres Cathedral. Some images of it from the side. You can see there's this intense detail work on the side as well, and you can just about make out the flying buttresses. Flying buttresses are these sort of long arch-like things on the outside, and they're called flying because they're kind of flying away on the outside. And basically, what they are is they are support to make the building even bigger. So you always want to build more and more impressive cathedrals because you're, doing it all for the glory and splendor of God. So you want to make something as impressive as possible. And at a certain point, they figured out they could use these exterior arches, these buttresses, to help hold everything up and to give it more strength so they could build even bigger and bigger, which is pretty cool. If you look at it, it's sort of the weight distribution is helped out by these exterior arches, basically. Yeah. So yeah, the classic example of a Gothic architecture, and I think it's interesting. So far we've been looking at how ideas of the medieval world filter into our popular culture. So with that in mind, I'd like to take a look at some of the most Gothic architecture I've ever seen, which is in the video game Dark Souls. The big city of Anor Londo has this enormous cathedral that could never exist in real life, and it just has buttresses upon buttresses upon buttresses. It just has an absurd amount of buttresses. Like if you look at here, it's like they take everything that's in real Gothic architecture and they take it to the next level into this enormous fantasy thing. So if you're trying to remember Gothic architecture, this is the kind of imagery to be thinking of. Just the level of detail and the level of sort of overall buttresses, basically. The size and the scope. This is sort of the dream that people who were making Gothic architecture had. The other big thing about Gothic architecture is the stained glass. So the stained glass is a really big part, and again, it's that focus on detail that really comes along 1200s onward. I think we can connect this to a time of sort of soul searching for the Roman Catholic Church around the 1100s and 1200s too. But look at how much detail there is in this. We got Mother Mary and Jesus. We've got so much. We've got all the different lives of the saints appearing in the stained glass. We've got so many different little things. I mean, there's just so much going on. We've got the big stained glass window with the Jesus in the center. We've got the five scenes from the Bible around here, and we've also got scenes from the Bible all through here and all through here. It's just everything. You can have so many stories being depicted in visual form. And scroll back here. And I think that's, remember where people don't usually have a whole lot of access to writing. So how are they going to get familiar with the Bible stories, which are so important in their lives? They're going to do it through these cathedrals. They're going to see the visual representation of it. And this is also a time where art is expensive and really hard to get. So, you have all this interest in these stories, and you go to a cathedral like this, it's going to blow you away because this is going to have some of the most images that you've ever seen in your life, and it's going to have these important images that are going to tell you the stories of the Bible, which the priests are always talking about. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, look at all the detail that's going on there, and just sort of, in some ways there's some simplicity and stylization, but there's also details of the cloth and things like that. So there's a sort of move back towards realism, which was kind of neglected in the earlier part of the Middle Ages. And like I said, there's a more of an interest in history and going back to thinking about the ancients. So you've got, of course, the lives of the saints, but they're going back towards something more like that style of Greek sculpture where you can depict cloth and whatnot. And they're showing with all their saints. This is, I believe, from Notre Dame. It's either Notre Dame or Chartres Cathedral, which are two similar big Gothic cathedrals. You've got Pythagoras from all the way back in Greek times being treated as, an important figure of history. Maybe not a saint exactly, but almost as important as a saint is to look back on these Greek and Roman figures and to think about them. So it's a changing relationship to all that. Whereas before they might not have paid that much attention to the more distant past. Now they're thinking about it again and learning about history and thinking about all those things again, which is the kind of stuff we like. Okay, so we'll leave off there and we'll talk about some more stuff in the next video.